So now we're being lied to again, as Bolton and Trump push us closer and closer to a war with Iran. Join me in sending a strong message to Donald Trump. The U.S. must not go to war with Iran.
Is there some sort of intervention in Iran on the horizon? To discuss it all with tonight's special guest, Hawaii Congresswoman and 2020 presidential contender, Democrat Tulsi Gabbard. Nice to have you with us tonight.
Thank you, Shannon. Great to be here.
I think it's fake news, okay? Now, would I do that? Absolutely. But we have not planned for that.
So the president said today when he was asked point blank, are we heading to war with Iran? He says, I hope not. Yeah. Secretary Pompeo has said that's absolutely the opposite of what we want.
But keep in mind that Secretary Pompeo also boasts about lying. Apparently, Pompeo thinks it's funny and somehow glorious to tell lies.
I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
This threat from Iran remains.
You have no problem saying unequivocally that this wasn't hyped by the administration for political purposes?
None. No overhype.
You and Bolton are on the same page?
Yes.
And so there's a lot of talk about the fact that the president has been telling his aides, I don't want this to escalate. This is absolutely not something we want to get into. You know, during the campaign, he talked all the time about getting us out of places. He does not want to be somebody who gets into foreign incursions that we don't need to.
But you know, during the campaign, Trump also talked about how he supposedly was self-funding, how he didn't want anybody's money. And Trump also said that when Sheldon Adelson gives money to a politician, Sheldon Adelson has total control over that politician.
I know why you're not going to support me. And, you know, you're not going to support me because I don't want your money.
Special interests and lobbyists. And they're all cheering on their candidate because their candidates will do whatever they want them to do. I'm self-funding my campaign. I'm putting up my own money.
And by the way, I'm a self-funder.
Donald Trump's view on how Sheldon Adelson's giving works back in 2016 about the candidate you work for, Marco Rubio. Take a listen.
I like Sheldon a lot. He's been a person that I've known over the years. We have a very good relationship. And, you know, I'm self-funding. I don't want anybody's money. But if Sheldon gives to him, he'll have total control over Rubio. And that's the problem with the way the system works.
Seems kind of accurate.
Casino mogul Sheldon Adelson. He's worth an estimated $30 billion.
One of the biggest donors to Trump's presidential campaign.
Not only did his company notch a first quarter windfall of $670 million as a result of the massive Republican tax cut, he also scored big in his foreign policy interests. Trump scuttled the Iran deal as he hoped that he would and is going to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, also a big Adelson priority.
On behalf of the 45th President of the United States on America, we welcome you officially and for the first time to the Embassy of the United States here in Jerusalem.
Does it convince you now that he's seen something significant to change his mind?
What Trump has seen is a significant amount of Sheldon Adelson's money. And what Trump has done is put John Bolton in one of the most powerful positions because Sheldon Adelson wants John Bolton to threaten Iran. Trump and the GOP's biggest donor may now have installed their man. As a result, the likelihood of a new U.S. war of choice in the Middle East has risen dramatically.
He does not want to be somebody who gets into foreign incursions that we don't need to.
Wait a minute, we don't actually know what Trump wants because you cannot rely on what he has said. He repeatedly said correctly that Obama had no right to bomb Syria without congressional authorization, but then he turns around and bombs Syria without congressional authorization. There's no reason to trust anything Trump says.
I would look at two things. First of all, as a soldier, I understand the need for us to be prepared, and I understand the need for us to keep the American people safe, to put our national security at the forefront. What's concerning to me is that while Trump and others in his administration are saying that they don't want to go to war with Iran, I hear them saying that more now that they're getting a lot of pushback from our allies, like those in the UK, when in fact the actions that the administration has been taking are telling us another story, that it's actually pushing us closer and closer to the prospect of a war with Iran. This is what I'm very concerned about, because I know that that cost on our troops, on the American people, on civilians across the Middle East and the region, creating more refugees, creating more instability in Europe. I mean, the cost would be very great. So help me God. President Trump promised us during his campaign to get the United States out of stupid wars.
You said he lied. He got us into the war with lies.
Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake. We spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. Iran is taking over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world. Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East. I want to tell you, they lied. Okay. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none, and they knew there were none. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
All right. Governor
John Bolton and others lied to us about the war in Iraq. They said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction.
Bolton was one of the biggest liars, yet Trump appoints him as national security advisor.
I want to thank Ambassador John Bolton for joining us. I think he's going to be a fantastic representative of our team. He's highly respected by everybody in this room. And John, I want to thank you very much. This is going to be a lot of work. Interesting day. He picked today as his first day. So, generals, I think he picked the right day. But certainly you're going to find it very exciting. But you are going to do a fantastic job, and I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much.
What we're seeing are actions coming from President Trump and his administration, led by John Bolton, that are dangerously escalating us closer and closer towards a devastating war with Iran.
Do you think they're exaggerating the threat? Do you think, as someone who served in Iraq, you know well the lead up to the Iraq war, do you see parallels here? Our country may...
You know, I've served in the Army National Guard now for over 16 years and went through this same thing in Iraq, a war that was championed by people like John Bolton, who lied to us and the American people, saying Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. He's going to give them to al-Qaeda. That led us to a devastating war in Iraq that took over 4,000 American service members' lives, injuring many more, killing and injuring countless Iraqis, and strengthening terrorist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda. And the reality of what we're seeing here is it appears John Bolton is using that same playbook once again to lead our country into war with Iran.
We are there to deter aggression. President Trump does not want war.
If you have a hard time believing that Bolton would lie, listen how he justifies lying in conducting national security affairs and makes excuses for him to act unethically around the world.
Now, I want to make the case for secrecy in government when it comes to the conduct of national security affairs, and possibly for deception where that's appropriate. You know, Winston Churchill said during World War II that in wartime, truth is so important it should be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies.
Do you really believe that?
Absolutely. If I had to say something I knew was false to protect American national security, I would do it.
Bolton does give an example of lying during wartime, but he is using it to excuse lying while conducting national security affairs. Listen to what he says to the next question.
Why do people in the government think that the rules of society or the laws don't apply to them?
Because they are not dealing in the civil society we live in under the Constitution. They are dealing in an anarchic environment internationally where different rules apply.
He's claiming that international affairs are just lawless, so therefore he doesn't have to abide by international law.
But you took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and the Constitution mandates certain openness and certain fairness. You're willing to do away with that in order to achieve a temporary military goal?
And I think, as Justice Jackson said in a famous decision, the Constitution's not a suicide pact.
What Bolton is saying isn't true. What Jackson said was not a Supreme Court decision. The majority opinion is the Supreme Court decision. Jackson's opinion was in the minority. Jackson's opinion was a dissenting opinion. That means Jackson's opinion was on the losing side of the case. It wasn't a Supreme Court decision. That Supreme Court decision upheld the man's First Amendment rights. Justin Jackson was on the losing side, who argued for violating the man's constitutional right to free speech. Bolton is using the dissent, the losing side, to justify violating the Constitution.
The Constitution's not a suicide pact.
But you took an oath to it.
That's exactly right. And I think defending the United States from foreign threats does require actions that in a normal business environment in the United States we would find unprofessional. Yeah. I don't make any apology for it.
My question is why the United States was making false claims to the United Nations. Who put this claim into the State Department fact sheet?
I have no idea. I didn't participate in the drafting of the fact sheet. I first saw it for the first time, I believe, last year during my confirmation hearing.
Again, you were the top arms control official. How could it be that the President, the Defense Secretary, the National Security Advisor, all of these top administration officials are making this claim when the National Intelligence Council specifically warned it was bogus?
That would have to be your answer would be the last response.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd have to ask them.
Do you accept any responsibility for having failed these officials, for allowing them to repeat this falsehood?
I don't think anybody ever asked me whether I thought they ought to say it or not. And you know, I'm sorry to disappoint you, Congressman. I had no role in this issue.
Did you speak out against?
The gentleman's time is over. Thank you.
I would like to answer. I honestly don't recall this being an issue that I spent any time on.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry.
It's amazing.
Sorry.
How much more time do you have? Do you have 10 more minutes?
I'm having fun, Mr. Chairman. I can spend a few more minutes. I had no involvement myself in the preparation of the fact sheet.
I have here, however, a timeline prepared by the State Department IG. And here's what it says. The Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Public Affairs asked the Undersecretary of Arms Control and International Security, you, for help. The Undersecretary, Bolton, agrees and tasks the Bureau of Nonproliferation. Your office subsequently reviewed multiple drafts of the facts sheet. Your testimony was that you had no involvement, but this IG review finds that you did.
I wish I could explain to you more comprehensively how the State Department works, because I think your questions reveal that perhaps you would benefit from that information.
No, I think my questions are about what you did as the boss of the department that was supposed to be in charge of arms control, which was directly involved in the biggest issue of our time.
I think the biggest disappointment to you, Congressman, is that I had no involvement. I'm sorry about that.
Well, that is disappointing. You didn't do your job.
Well,
here we are on this merry-go-round about you have people under your supervision, but they're not under your control, under circumstances that would require very close scrutiny and supervision. This is an issue of major U.S. policy.
No, the preparation of a fact sheet, Congressman, is not a major issue of U.S. policy. This was a staff-level function done
when we're making a decision whether or not to go to war because a foreign country, because Iraq is trying to acquire nuclear weapons, that is a major issue. That is a major issue.
Mr. Van Hollen,
this was not a policy issue of any significance. It was the preparation of a fact sheet to hand to the press about the Iraqi declaration of their weapons.
They were trying to persuade the Congress to approve the War Powers Act. That's what this is about.
I first met John Bolton 25 years ago. We were on opposite sides of a public debate on the question of the nature of the United Nations.
There is no United Nations. There is an international community that occasionally can be led by the only real power left in the world, and that's the United States, when it suits our interest and when we can get others to go along. The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest.
His role has not been that of somebody who just was a pundit who wrote editorials supporting the war in Iraq, for instance. He was actually helping to have it happen. And one of the things that was the responsibility of John Bolton was to orchestrate the ouster of Jose Bustani. This is when Iraq was talking about wanting to join the Chemical Weapons Treaty. To do that, he would have had to submit the whole country to massively intrusive inspections. That was not in Washington's interest, because it would have proved that there were, in fact, no weapons of mass destruction. So the work went on, led by John Bolton, to get him out.
I got a phone call from John Bolton from Washington to tell me that I should resign from the organization, and I asked him why. He said, your management style is not agreeable to Washington. I said, no way. So he came to The Hague, and he came to my office, and he said, you have to resign, and I give you 24 hours. And I said, no way, I don't have any reason to do that. I was elected by all the member states of the organization. It's only you, the United States, that are challenging my management style. And he said, we have already discussed with your government that you should resign. I said, I don't know of any agreement with my government. And then he said, okay, so there will be retaliations. Prepare to accept the consequences. We know where your kids are. And that moment, two of my kids were in New York. They studied in the United States. One of them is American, for that matter, was born in New York. He's a Brazilian-American. And I had another daughter in London. And I said, I'm prepared. My family is aware of what's going on, so it's prepared to face the consequences. So go ahead. And he was a little bit shocked with that, and he left. He's not a man you can have a dialogue with.
When he refused to step down, Bolton orchestrated a move to vote him out. It had never happened before. He was voted out and replaced by someone who would respond to the U.S. need to keep the inspectors out of Iraq. So he played a very key role in setting the stage very directly for the Iraq War.
If people are saying Bolton is the devil in the flesh, it's because of his evil actions. And that's not a joke. Both Bolton and Mattis should be prosecuted in the International Criminal Court.
I heard you're actually the devil incarnate, and I wanted to meet you. Bolton laughed. The Secretary of Defense laughed.
This is a sardonic comment about this sick situation.
I've heard that you're absolutely the devil incarnate. I wanted to meet you.
For years, he has been pushing for war. He wanted war against Iraq. He wants and wanted war against Iran. He wanted and wants war against North Korea. He has always supported war and opposed diplomacy in the interests of Israel in some cases, in the interests of the right-wing views in the United States in other circumstances.
And that has been his history. This is, I hesitate to use the word, a guy who likes war.
Bolton likes war, but he doesn't like the idea of him fighting in a war. Although he advocated for America to fight the Vietnam War, he made sure that he wouldn't have to do the fighting. He admits himself that he made an effort not to get drafted by driving around the Baltimore area, getting himself on waiting lists until he could get himself into the Maryland National Guard. And not only did he dodge the draft for the Vietnam War, look how he dodges this question of whether he'd fight in the Iraq War, which he advocated for too.
Were you a supporter of President Bush's move into Iraq?
I was. I felt that eliminating Saddam Hussein's regime was correct. Knowing everything we know today is still unquestionably, in my mind, that it was the right thing to do.
If you were of draft age or if you were of military age, would you go there to fight?
I think at this point, it's the American interest is very limited, and I can't really answer that question directly.
So he can't say whether he'd serve, and says the American interest is limited, yet he was supporting the surge at the time of that interview.
I believe the current policy, the surge policy, is the right policy to pursue.
The reason I ask you is because you have a couple of quotes in your own book.
I had concluded that the Vietnam War was lost, and I made the cold calculation that I wasn't going to waste time on a futile struggle.
And I found one in the Yale Daily News. You say, I confess I had no desire to die in a Southeast Asian rice paddy. I considered the Vietnam War already lost. What about people today? I mean, this country is divided over this issue. And if you had a family, you've got a daughter, but if you had if there's the draft and your daughter had to go or your son would go, what would you think now?
Yeah. Well, the Vietnam point, I think, is important because we did face a draft at that point, and it was a very different circumstance than I think we face with a volunteer army today. I believe the current policy, the surge policy, is the right policy to pursue.
Those who refused to fight in the war which they opposed and protested against were, of course, correct and morally consistent. But what Bolton did was avoid fighting in that war, while at the same time supporting that war, and also denouncing and mocking those who opposed it and sought an end to it.
The incessant politicization of every aspect of Yale life was the most dangerous consequence of the late 60s. One example was at our Class Day exercise, a traditional part of Yale's graduation ritual. In 1970, our class leaders decided that Class Day would be all about Vietnam rather than about graduation, which I didn't like at all. That was the last straw. These rich kids might enjoy perverting Class Day, but my mother and firefighter father were not coming to their son's graduation for a political seminar. I shoehorned my way into the Class Day program, determined to have my say, at least to the class of 1970's parents, if not to the students. I was greeted by hecklers, the only speakers so graced. What you have over there, I said, pointing to the hecklers, is a typical example of liberal tolerance. This very Class Day program I went on was a typical example of liberal self-congratulation, and I called for an end to the politics of this weekend and a return to the joy and happiness that commencement is supposed to be.
How much joy were people getting killed in the Vietnam War feeling? How much happiness did those who got drafted and sent to Vietnam feel? In his book, Bolton boasts about a speech to Yale students where he lectured them for protesting against the war. But did anyone in that audience know that he was dodging the draft for the war which he was scolding them for opposing? Here's another of his excuses for not serving in the war he supported. And its premise is ludicrous, too. The U.S. goal was not to take and keep Vietnamese territory. The acquisition of territory by war is illegal. But Bolton doesn't care about violating international law. Mr. Bolton, in particular, believes the United States can do what it wants without regard to international law, treaties, or the political commitments of previous administrations. There are few people more likely than Mr. Bolton to lead the country into war. It's ludicrous that Bolton is even national security advisor because his policies and his actions undermine our national security. Our national security is being put at an unreasonable degree of risk. Every day, John Bolton continues as the national security advisor for President Trump. Bolton's lifelong lust for war and his disregard for international law make him one of the most dangerous people in our government.
I know Bolton from way back. At a distance, I've never met him personally. He's told lies about things where I knew the truth. The National Security Advisor, I know from experience, is the most listened to advice that a president gets.
We must do everything we can to stop this craven and corrupt man from getting more Americans killed and getting Iranians killed, all needlessly and immorally. This is a man that has no ethics and no morals. It's no exaggeration. This man is a sociopath. The use of baby formula was killing babies in the developing world because it was overly diluted or mixed with dirty water. Bolton cared more about the profits of the Nestle Corporation, the maker of the baby formula, than about the lives of babies. He has no regard for the lives of anyone. He screamed at a woman that she was fired because she wouldn't help him weaken UN codes written to protect the lives of babies in the third world. Bolton has no regard for morality or principles. He only cares about money and power. Bolton's entire career has been about serving powerful interests with no regard for ethics. An example of how underhanded Bolton is that he would go behind the backs of American officials and work against official U.S. policy in order to serve the interests of Israel. This is according to Danny Gillerman, the former Israeli ambassador to the UN. Look, many times he would call me or ask me to come and meet him, and for all intents and purposes would direct fire on his own forces in order to advance the interests of Israel, in contradiction to American policy. At the very moment that Powell was saying administration policy was not to attack Iran, Bolton was working with the Israelis to lay the groundwork for just such a war. And he angered State Department officials because he would be violating State Department protocol to have private meetings in Israel. To put it bluntly, Bolton cannot be trusted to serve the interests of the United States. Is an example where Bolton was visiting with Republican megadonor Sheldon Adelson. The most threatening line in Trump's UN speech came directly from Bolton. Bolton's been carrying out Adelson's agenda. For those that thought that Trump would keep Bolton in check, look at this. Trump reportedly seeks Adelson's advice amid differences with Bolton.
And I'd like to now ask the military aide to come forward and read the citations for each recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Miriam Adelson.
Keep in mind Sheldon Adelson's priorities.
All we care about is being good Zionists, being good citizens of Israel, because even though I'm not Israeli born, Israel is in my heart. I am not Israeli. The uniform that I wore in the military, unfortunately, was not an Israeli uniform. It was an American uniform. 4 of my 5 children are all Israeli. And I guess the one who's being bar mitzvahed will volunteer to be a sniper. He's a gun freak. Either that or he'll fly their predators.
Keep in mind Sheldon Adelson's agenda.
What do you mean support negotiation? What are we going to negotiate about? What I would say is, listen, you see that desert out there? I want to show you something. So you pick up your cell phone and you call somewhere in Nebraska and you say, okay, let it go. So there's an atomic weapon goes over ballistic missiles in the middle of the desert that doesn't hurt a soul. And then you say, see, the next one is in the middle of Tehran.
Sheldon Adelson's a thug just like John Bolton. They're thugs putting us at risk of another war in the Middle East.
It is almost impossible to imagine that after the horror of the war in Iraq, when we were lied to by the Bush administration, and one of the leading architects of that war, by the way, was this very same John Bolton, who remains one of the few people in the world who actually thinks today that the war in Iraq was a good idea, that we would once again go to war in that region. It appears that John Bolton wants a war in Iran. A war in Iran would, in my view, be many times worse than the Iraq war. U.S. military leaders have repeatedly told us if the United States were to attack Iran, Iran would respond with attacks on U.S. troops and allies around the world. It would lead to the further destabilization of that region in a way that is unimaginable and would result in wars that would go on year after year after year and likely cost trillions of dollars. The United States Congress must do everything it can to prevent a war with Iran. And by the way, not inconsequentially, the Constitution of the United States is very clear, and that is that it is the Congress and not the president who determines whether or not we go to war. Taking us into a war without congressional authorization would be unconstitutional and illegal. We do not need to fight another unnecessary war.
We have presidents in both parties for too long who've completely ignored Congress's constitutional responsibility to declare war. Congress is the one that has to bear that responsibility, and it's a great responsibility to declare war, to authorize the use of military force.
Remember how we got into the Vietnam War through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and it turns out that the so-called attack in the Gulf of Tonkin did not actually take place. It was based on a series of lies.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
What worries me is that the architect of the efforts right now to get us into a war in Iran is the guy who was the architect to getting us into the war in Iraq, and that is John Bolton. So I worry about provocations on the part of the United States against Iran, and I worry very much that this thing could flare up.
I look forward to the day where we can actually help Iran. We're not looking to hurt Iran.
President Trump says that he doesn't want war with Iran, but that's exactly what he wants, because that's exactly what Saudi Arabia, Netanyahu, Bolton, and other neocons and neolibs want. That's what he puts first, not America.
I ask all of the folks who are watching this program to stand up and fight back on this issue. We must not, we cannot allow ourselves to be dragged into another terrible, terrible war, which in my view will impact not only our generation, but the generation that our children and grandchildren live in as well. Thank you all very much.
To stop this man, let's boost this message. Please leave a like to this video, a comment to the video, that helps, and you can use the YouTube tools to share this video on social media and through emails. You can find links in the video description for other actions you can take. And also see this video where it's proven that Bush repeatedly lied about why he attacked Iraq. Bolton and Bush are both war criminals.